What if I told you that some of Britain's most famous royal deaths were not the clean, candlelit finales painted in portraits, but slow, confusing collapses labelled with names that sound like spells? Egg, dropsy, quinsy, the flux, the sweat. Imagine a palace corridor at midnight. Beeswax smoke, muffled prayers, and a physician whispering a diagnosis that means, in plain language, we don't really know, but we're afraid. Tonight we'll move in chronological order through 25 royals who died of illnesses that modern ears barely recognize, translating the old labels and lingering on the small human details: fear, denial, court politics, and the brutal limits of medicine. I'll keep it calm, precise and honest about what is certain and what remains disputed. If you'd like more British history to sleep to, take a second to like the video, subscribe and comment the topic you want next. Those tiny clicks quietly decide what gets made. Now breathe a little slower and let the centuries begin. Henry I and the lamprey surfeit. It is late autumn in 1135 and King Henry I is in Normandy, still working. He is not young. He has spent decades turning a turbulent kingdom into something more orderly than it has any right to be. And like so many rulers who believe the world will collapse if they stop moving, he keeps moving anyway. The old chroniclers say the end begins with a meal. Lampreys, eel-like fish that were considered a delicacy. The story survives because it is vivid, almost theatrical, an overindulgent king ignoring sensible advice, then paying for it with his life. Some versions say he had been warned not to eat them. Some suggest it was the sheer quantity, what the period might call a surfeit. In modern terms, you can read it as acute foodborne illness, or a catastrophic digestive event layered on top of an already fragile body. But here's the quiet twist. Surfeit is not a diagnosis in the way we mean it now. It is a moral label pretending to be medicine. It means excess. It means blame. It means the chronicler, watching a powerful man fail, can shape the story into a lesson. Eat too much, live too little. Henry's decline is described as feverish and abrupt. If it was food poisoning, it might have been bacteria, toxins, or something far more complicated. An infection, dehydration, organ failure. And in a world without antibiotics, without IV fluids, without a clear understanding of contamination, a sudden gut illness could be as lethal as a battlefield wound. His death matters beyond the dinner table. With Henry gone, the succession fractures and England tumbles into a civil war remembered as the anarchy. Years of rival claims, shifting loyalties, and ordinary people trapped under the boots of competing authorities. So the lamprey story lingers, not just because it's strange, but because it's unbearably human. The mighty brought down by something as mundane as what they ate. And speaking of royal bodies betraying royal plans, the next death on our path is one where the illness wasn't framed as indulgence, but as something far more humiliating, something the records called simply the flux. King John and the bloody flux. In October 1216, King John is on the move through eastern England, dragging the heavy machinery of kingship behind him. Men, horses, wagons, documents, treasure, and fear. This is not the romantic travel of minstrels and banners. It is grim logistics, done in mud and rain, with rebellion snapping at his heels. John's reign is already scarred by crisis. Barons have risen against him. The kingdom has fractured. The famous agreement sealed at Runnymede only the year before has not calmed the waters for long. And then, in the middle of this political storm, his body begins to fail. The sources use the language of the time: fever, dysentery, and the brutal old term, bloody flux. Flux is an ancient word that sounds almost abstract until you remember what it means. Violent diarrhea, often with blood, often with pain, often with dehydration that can kill quickly. It is not glamorous. It is not heroic. It is a humiliating, relentless unmaking. Some accounts place the start of his illness after he loses baggage and treasure in the wash, an incident so dramatic that it becomes legend. Whether the stress worsened his condition or the timing simply fused in memory, the result is the same. The king weakens, his campaign slows, and the machinery of rule begins to wobble. In a medieval sick room, treatment might mean rest, prayers, purging, bleeding, and attempts to balance the body's humours. But dysentery is not a mood that can be soothed away. It is a war being fought inside you, often from contaminated water, poor sanitation, and bacteria no one can see. It thrives in camps, on roads, and in wet season. John dies at Newark Castle on the night of 18/19, October 1216, still a relatively young man by royal standards. And there is a bleak irony here. Even kings can't negotiate with microbes. You can bargain with barons, you can threaten a city, you can squeeze taxes from a shire, but you can't intimidate contaminated water into becoming clean. John's death reshapes the political chessboard because his heir is a child, Henry III, and a child king invites regents, compromises, and shifting alliances. The body failing in a private chamber changes the public fate of a realm. Meanwhile, farther north, another king will spend decades proving himself unstoppable, until a very similar, very unromantic enemy catches him on the road. Edward Y. and Camp Fever on the long road north. Edward Thun is remembered as a hammer, hard, relentless, and heavy enough to leave dents in history. He wages war in Wales, he pushes power into Scotland. He builds castles like stone arguments, asserting control not only through force but through architecture that says, wordlessly, we are here and we will remain. By 1307, Edward is old but still moving north, still chasing the unfinished business of domination. And it is in this movement, this insistence on marching even when the body begs for stillness, that the end begins. The death of Edward the Firm is often described in terms that modern medicine struggles to pin down with certainty. Chroniclers mention illness, weakness, and what can be interpreted as dysentery or some form of camp fever. The phrase matters because medieval warfare is not just about battles, it's about camps, crowded, dirty places where waste and water mingle, where food spoils, where infections spread with quiet efficiency. Imagine a royal tent, damp air pressing in from the outside, smoke from a brazier clinging to wool and leather. Edward's physicians are learned by the standards of their day, but they cannot sterilize a knife, cannot measure electrolytes, cannot see the microscopic world that is rearranging his inside. They can advise, and they can pray, and they can bleed him, sometimes making the weakness worse. Edward dies on 7th July 1307 at Burr by Sands near the Solway Firth. Even the location sounds tired. Sand, water, the edge of land. There is an almost symbolic finality to it, a conqueror reaching the border and stopping, not by choice, but by collapse. What makes this death strange is not a bizarre symptom, but the way the period's labels blur together. Fever, flux, camp sickness, as if the chronicler is describing a storm by saying only that the sky went dark. And yet we can still read the shape of it, a long life of exertion ending with an illness common to the powerless as much as to kings. Edward's death passes the Scottish problem to Edward II, whose reign will be defined by weakness, faction, and disaster. A hard king ends and a softer one follows, proof that a single private sickness can alter the texture of a whole political era. And speaking of sickness that lingers, the next royal on our path doesn't die quickly. He is worn down over years by a disease chroniclers keep naming with that same brutal word, flux, the Black Prince, and the flux that never left him, Edward of Woodstock. The Black Prince is a name that sounds like a warning. He is the glittering heir of Edward III, a figure of chivalric legend. Armour, banners, victories in France. For many people in his own time, he is the future of the dynasty, a promise carved into steel, and then his body begins to betray him. The Black Prince's long decline is associated in many accounts with dysentery, often connected to campaigns on the Iberian Peninsula in the 1360s. The old sources speak again of the bloody flux, and unlike the sudden fatal episodes that struck other royals, this one seems to become chronic. recurring bouts, weakness, perhaps fever, a slow draining away of strength. To modern ears, dysentery can sound like a single illness with a neat label. In reality, it can be caused by different pathogens, bacteria like Shigella, parasites like amoebas, each with their own patterns. A chronic course, especially after travel and campaigning, invites possibilities. Persistent infection, damaged intestines, complications that leave a person vulnerable to everything else. What's striking is how the prince's political power shrinks as his physical power shrinks. He returns to England and can't keep pace. He withdraws from public life for long stretches, and the court, which thrives on presence, on being seen, on appearing strong, begins to orbit around other centres of gravity. In the language of medieval chroniclers, disease is not just biology, it's narrative. It raises questions people whisper in corridors. Has God withdrawn favour? Is the dynasty cursed? Is victory always followed by payment? The Black Prince dies on 8th June 1376, a year before his father. He never becomes king, and the consequence is enormous. The crown passes not to a seasoned warrior, but to his young son, Richard II, a boy surrounded by adults with ambitions sharp enough to cut through him. There is also a softer consequence, easy to miss, a warrior culture forced to watch its brightest symbol fade in bedclothes. The prince's illness doesn't just take a life, it punctures a myth. It reminds everyone, quietly, insistently, that strength is borrowed, not owned. And speaking of myths unravelling, the next king's illness becomes something almost theatrical, a fog of rumour, fear, and a label that people loved to use when they wanted to stain a reputation: leprosy. Henry IV and the Leper King rumour. Henry IV takes the throne in 1399 by force and politics, deposing Richard II, reshaping the idea of legitimacy with a hard, pragmatic hand. A crown taken this way never sits lightly. It itches. It demands constant proof. As Henry ages, chroniclers and later storytellers describe a cluster of ailments, episodes that sound like seizures or strokes, periods of collapse, and a disfiguring skin condition that sparks whispers. Some later traditions insist he had leprosy. Others suggest a severe dermatological problem, something like psoriasis, or a different chronic illness entirely. Here's the strange part. Leprosy, in medieval Europe, is as much a social verdict as a medical one. True, Hansen's disease existed, yes, but the term was also used loosely for a range of skin diseases and for moral condemnation. To call a king leprous is to suggest he is unclean, cursed, marked. It is medicine as propaganda. Henry's symptoms, whatever they were, become politically useful to his enemies. A sick king is vulnerable, not just physically, but symbolically. In an era where rulers are expected to embody divine order, visible decay looks like a crack in the universe. He dies in 1413, famously at the Jerusalem Chamber in Westminster Abbey, fulfilling a prophecy-like detail that later writers adore. But the specific cause remains debated. Some modern historians have suggested cardiovascular disease, strokes, or neurological episodes, layered with a chronic skin condition. Others leave the question open, because the evidence is not precise enough to pretend certainty. Still, the atmosphere is clear. Imagine the chamber, stone walls holding the cold, a fire trying to push it back, the sound of cloth and footsteps as attendants move softly. Outside, politics continues as if the king is already gone, because in a sense, he is. A ruler's strength is partly the belief that he is strong. Henry's death brings Henry V to the throne, the warrior king, the bright flare of Agincourt, and the contrast is almost cruel. One king rumoured to be rotting, the next painted as gleaming and invincible. But invincible kings are exactly the ones history loves to humble, and Henry V will meet the same old enemy on the road, a sickness of the gut, a fever of filth, the ancient terror called the flux. Henry V and dysentery at Vincennes. Henry V's life has the tempo of a drum. He reforms his court. He fights in France. He wins Agincourt in 1415 and becomes a legend while still breathing. He marries Catherine of Valois, and comes within touching distance of uniting crowns through conquest and treaty. And then, in 1422, the story turns sharply, because it turns into biology. Henry falls ill during the campaign in France, and the best supported descriptions point toward dysentery. Again, the flux, sometimes called the bloody flux. The setting matters. Armies on the move, latrines dug too close to water sources, food handled in heat and haste, a constant churn of bodies and waste. Even disciplined forces cannot fully escape the microbial world. The king's illness is severe enough that he is taken to the Château de Vincennes, near Paris. Picture it, a fortress that feels safe in a military sense. Walls, guards, protocols, yet utterly powerless against what's happening in his intestines, his bloodstream, his hydration, his fever. Medical care in the early 15th century is a mixture of learning and blindness. Physicians can recognize patterns and prognoses. They can't correct the underlying cause. Treatments may include dietary restrictions, herbal preparations, and the ever-present temptation to bleed or purge, methods that often worsen dehydration. Henry dies on 31st August 1422, only 35 years old. 35, an age at which the mythology expects a ruler to be in full force, not fading into sheets. The consequences are dramatic and painfully familiar. A child inherits. Henry VI is an infant. The English position in France becomes a contest between factions and regents, and the long arc bends toward the losses and upheavals that will eventually feed the Wars of the Roses. There's also a quieter consequence. The legend of Henry V becomes fixed, sealed by an early death. He never has to become old, compromised, or disappointing. Disease, in a strange way, preserves him, like a candle snuffed at its brightest point. And speaking of dynastic futures being rearranged by illness, our next royal death is not a king at all, but a man whose early end shapes everything that follows. Edmund Tudor, taken by the oldest terror in medieval towns, the plague. Edmund Tudor and the plague at Carmarthen. Edmund Tudor is not born a king, but he becomes the father of one, Henry VII, the man who ends the Wars of the Roses and begins the Tudor dynasty. That sounds grand when you say it quickly, but Edmund's real life is shorter, harsher, and far less certain. In 1456, Edmund is in Wales, caught in the dangerous crosswinds of Lancastrian and Yorkist conflict. His wife, Margaret Beaufort, is pregnant, still very young, carrying a child who will become history. The future is literally in her body, and Edmund, charged with holding territory and influence, is moving through a world where disease can ambush you faster than any rival army. He falls ill in Carmarthen, and many accounts describe the illness as the plague. That label too can be imprecise. Medieval writers used plague for a range of epidemic fevers, but the broader point is clear: an infectious outbreak, swift and terrifying, strong enough to kill a nobleman despite whatever care money can buy. Imagine the town under strain, fear in doorways, the sick hidden away, the smell of smoke from attempts to cleanse the air, prayers muttered with the urgency of people who know prayer might be all they have. Plague is a social illness as much as a physical one. It empties streets. It changes how people touch, how they trade, how they bury their dead. Edmund dies on 3rd November 1456. Margaret is left a widow, pregnant, politically exposed. She will spend the rest of her life as a kind of quiet engine, protecting her son's claim, forging alliances, surviving. Edmund's death is therefore one of those hinge moments you can miss if you only look at Crown. Here, the strange disease is not strange in symptom, but in scale, the way it turns entire communities into haunted spaces. It is history's reminder that dynasties are not built only by battles and marriages. They are built by who survives the winter, who avoids the contaminated room, who happens not to breathe in the wrong air at the wrong time. And speaking of the future carried precariously forward, the next royal death happens in a place that should feel safe. Court, childbirth, ceremony, yet it introduces another old horror with a deceptively gentle name: childbed fever. Elizabeth of York and childbed fever. Elizabeth of York is a symbol made flesh. Her marriage to Henry VI in 1486 helps fuse two rival houses, York and Lancaster, into the fragile promise of peace after decades of civil war. In portraits, she is calm, composed, almost timeless. In real life, she is a woman living under enormous dynastic pressure. Produce heirs, stabilize the realm, embody the reconciliation everyone claims to want. In 1503, Elizabeth is pregnant again. Pregnancy at court is not private, it is political. Everyone waits on the outcome like gamblers around a table, pretending it's piety instead of stakes. She gives birth to a daughter, Catherine, on 2nd February 1503. The baby dies within days, and then Elizabeth becomes ill. The likely culprit, described in broad terms by contemporary accounts, is what later generations call puerperal fever, childbed fever, an infection that strikes after childbirth. In the pre-antibiotic world, it is devastatingly common and often swift. It can come from unclean hands, unclean linens, unclean instruments, though the people involved would not understand it that way. They might speak of bad air, weak humours, or the body failing to close properly after birth. It is a cruel irony. The very act meant to secure the dynasty becomes the act that kills the queen. And because Elizabeth is royal, her death is recorded, mourned, and wrapped in ritual. But the disease itself, this invisible infection, does not care about ritual. Elizabeth dies on 11th February 1503, only 37 years old. Henry VII is reportedly shaken in a way he rarely allows anyone to see. He withdraws. He becomes more cautious, more isolated, more suspicious, traits he already possesses now sharpened by grief. The political consequence is stark. Henry is left without the queen who anchored his legitimacy. The emotional consequence is quieter but heavy. The court watches a young mother die from an illness that, in their world, can feel like fate's random cruelty. And speaking of fate, arriving disguised as medicine, our next entry is about a prince whose death seems to explode out of nowhere. A sickness so infamous, so mysterious, that even its name feels like a whisper. The sweating sickness. Arthur, Prince of Wales, and sweating sickness. Arthur, Prince of Wales, is meant to be the future. He is the eldest son of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, named carefully. Arthur, like the legend, like Britain itself as imagined in story. He is married to Catherine of Aragon, a diplomatic triumph, a bridge to Spain, a promise of international strength. In 1502, Arthur and Catherine are sent to Ludlow Castle in the Welsh Marches to begin life as Prince and Princess of Wales. It should be ceremonial, hopeful, full of carefully staged domesticity. Instead, within months, they fall ill. The illness is often identified as sweating sickness, though historians debate whether it truly was that specific phenomenon. The sweat is one of the great medical mysteries of late medieval and early Tudor England. A disease characterized in reports by sudden onset, chills, intense sweating, weakness, and often rapid death. It appears in outbreaks, vanishes, returns. No one is entirely sure what caused it. Some theories propose an influenza-like virus, others suggest hantavirus or a different infectious agent. The evidence is not enough for certainty, and that uncertainty is part of its eerie power. What we do know is the effect. Arthur becomes gravely ill in late March 1502 and dies on 2nd April 1502, aged 15. 15, an age at which history has barely begun to touch you, yet already it's taking your name. Catherine survives, Arthur does not, and the consequences are enormous. Arthur's younger brother becomes heir, Henry, the future Henry VIII. Catherine, after years of legal and theological manoeuvring, will marry him instead. The entire English Reformation, the break with Rome, the cascade of marriages and executions, so much of it depends on this one strange sickness in a damp castle room. In the moment, though, the room is small, the smell of sweat and linen, the anxious murmurs of attendants, the helplessness of physicians who can offer little beyond watchfulness and prayers. The royal body, meant to symbolize continuity, becomes fragile flesh, And speaking of royal women caught in the deadly mechanics of childbirth, our next entry is another queen whose death is wrapped in the soft language of fever, but whose reality is the hard edge of infection. Jane Seymour and puerperal fever. Jane Seymour becomes queen in 1536, in the shadow of catastrophe. Henry VIII has executed Anne Boleyn. The court is tense, watchful, learning again that royal favour can turn lethal. Jane is presented as gentler, quieter, safer, and for Henry she is something more important than any personality. She is hope for a male heir. In October 1537, Jane gives birth to the long-awaited son, Edward, future Edward VI. The celebrations are immense, because the dynasty has been desperate for this moment. Bells, feasts, proclamations, the kingdom exhales, and then the queen begins to fade. Jane's death, on 24th October 1537, is widely associated with puerperal fever, childbed fever, an infection following childbirth. She survives the delivery itself, which already tells you something. This is not simply exhaustion, not merely weakness. This is the creeping, often sudden takeover of the body by bacteria. Fever, chills, pain, a rapid decline. The tragedy is sharpened by the era's medical blindness. No one in that room would understand the role of microbes. Cleanliness exists as a concept. Bathing, fresh linens, pleasant smells, but not as sterilization. Hands move from person to person. Cloth is reused. Instruments are not boiled. Even in a royal chamber, the conditions that invite infection can quietly flourish. Jane is mourned intensely by Henry, and her death is turned into a kind of ideal. She is the queen who gave him a son and died. Therefore, in the grim calculus of Tudor storytelling, she becomes good. The court sentimentalizes her partly because it is useful. It frames Henry's desire for heirs as noble rather than obsessive, and it allows everyone to pretend the system isn't devouring women, but the system is exactly what killed her. The pressure for succession, the repeated pregnancies expected of queens, the medical practices that couldn't protect them. Jane's death is not an isolated tragedy, it is a structural one, and now, with the longed-for heir born, the dynasty looks stable, until you remember what disease does best. It waits, it returns, it finds the next vulnerable body, and the next royal illness on our path is one with an old, slow name that sounds almost poetic. Consumption. Henry Fitzroy and consumption in a gilded room. Henry Fitzroy, Henry VIII's acknowledged illegitimate son, lives a life that is both privileged and precarious. He is given titles, households, tutors, and a kind of public importance that feels like a royal rehearsal. In a court obsessed with heirs, he is the spare child nobody officially asked for, yet everyone quietly notices. By the mid-1530s, reports describe him as unwell. The old word that hangs around his death is one you've almost certainly heard, but rarely in its original, chilling context. Consumption. In Tudor language, consumption isn't poetry. It's a diagnosis built from observation, weight loss, chronic cough, fatigue, the sense that the body is being eaten from the inside. It can point to tuberculosis, but it can also cover other wasting illnesses. The trouble is that the label tells you what people saw, not what caused it. Historical accounts place Fitzroy's death on 23rd of July 1536, at just 17. You can picture the cruel contrast: rich fabrics, well-fed attendants, the very best care money can buy, and still a teenager fading as if he's been left out in cold rain. If it was tuberculosis, the risk isn't surprising. Crowded indoor living, smoky air, poor understanding of contagion. Palaces weren't the clean refugees people imagine. They were human ecosystems, and disease moved through them like gossip. And the consequence is quietly enormous. Fitzroy's death removes one potential answer to Henry VIII's succession anxieties. The king's obsession with producing a legitimate male heir doesn't soften after this loss. If anything, it tightens, like a fist. And speaking of that obsession, the next body that begins to fail is Henry's own, an aging monarch whose physicians reach for an old, slippery term when swelling and decay become impossible to ignore. Henry VIII, and dropsy behind the tapestries. By the time Henry VIII approaches the end, he is no longer the athletic prince of early portraits. He is heavy, in pain, and increasingly trapped by his own body. The court still performs grandeur, music, ceremony, velvet, but beneath it there is the persistent reality of chronic illness. Contemporary descriptions of Henry's final years include severe leg ulcers, limited mobility, and episodes of swelling. One of the period's favourite catch-all terms for that swelling is dropsy. Dropsy isn't a single disease, it's a symptom turned into a label. Fluid accumulating in tissues, making limbs and abdomen puff and strain. Today we'd associate it with heart failure, kidney failure, liver disease, or a combination. Tudor observers didn't have those categories. They had what they could see. A king filling with water like a doomed ship. Henry dies on 28th of January 1547. Records indicate his health had been deteriorating for years, and it's entirely possible multiple conditions were at work. Metabolic illness, chronic infection from wounds, cardiovascular strain. Some accounts suggest his leg ulcerations were foul and persistent, the sort of slow infection that can exhaust a body and seed wider complication. There's a grim irony in how dropsy flatters the storyteller. It makes death sound gentle, almost languid, but swelling like that often comes with breathlessness, fatigue, and a slow suffocation from within. It can be frightening and miserable, especially if you are a man used to bending the world by force of personality. Henry's death hands the throne to Edward VI, a child, and once again the kingdom is ruled by adults orbiting a minor. Regents, councils, factions, each with their own version of the realm's best interests, which usually looks a lot like their own. Meanwhile, Henry's first queen, Catherine of Aragon, has already died years earlier, and her end is wrapped in another old-style label, a long, wasting sickness that invites rumour, because certainty is in short supply. Catherine of Aragon and the wasting disease that sparked whispers. Catherine of Aragon's life in England is a slow tightening of circumstances. She arrives as a princess, becomes Henry VIII's queen, and then is pushed aside in a political and spiritual earthquake. By the 1530s, she is separated from court, stripped of title in practice, if not in dignity, and watched carefully, because a discarded queen is still dangerous if she can become a symbol. Catherine dies on 7th January 1536 at Kimbolton Castle. Contemporary accounts describe a prolonged illness. Later examination of her body, reported by observers of the time, mentioned a dark growth near the heart, which fueled immediate speculation. In a world where poisoning is always a convenient story, rumours bloom, but historical analysis tends to treat poisoning as unproven and unlikely, and many modern interpretations lean toward cancer, possibly of the heart's lining or another internal malignancy, because a wasting decline fits that shape more than a sudden toxin would. The strange part here is not a quirky Tudor term like quinsy or ague. It's the way sickness becomes political theatre. If Catherine dies slowly, it can look like divine judgment to her enemies and martyrdom to her supporters. If she dies suspiciously, it can look like murder. Either way, her body becomes evidence in arguments that have nothing to do with biology. Picture the isolation of her final months. Fewer visitors, colder rooms, letters instead of presents. Even pain becomes mediated by politics. Her death removes a living obstacle to Henry's marital plans, but it doesn't remove the moral controversy, it intensifies it. And speaking of queens whose bodies become battlegrounds, the next death is more brutally straightforward. A queen survives intrigue and reform, only to be killed by a very old killer, childbed fever, after doing the one thing queens are expected to do. Catherine Parr and childbed fever after the crown. Catherine Parr is the wife Henry VIII doesn't execute, doesn't cast off, doesn't publicly destroy. She is intelligent, politically alert, and, by the standards of that court, remarkably lucky. She outlives Henry, and for a brief moment steps into a strange new role, dowager queen with a future. Then she becomes pregnant, and the old world closes its jaws again. Catherine gives birth to a daughter, Mary Seymour, in late August 1548. Within days she falls ill and dies on 5 September 1548 at Sudeley Castle. The most widely accepted explanation is puerperal fever, childbed fever, an infection following childbirth. Once again, the pattern repeats, a successful delivery followed by fever, weakness, and rapid decline. Historical records describe the fear and confusion surrounding these fevers. People did not understand germs. They often believed the womb needed to be cleansed. And interventions, manual examinations, reused linens, attendants moving between patients could make infection more likely. It is a system that feels almost designed to kill women while insisting it is helping them. Catherine's death also has a quieter sting. She had been, in some ways, a stabilizing adult presence for Henry's children. With her gone, the political landscape around young Edward VI becomes even more predatory. A queen's death is not only personal, it's structural. It changes who has access, who controls households, who shapes a child king's world. If you think that was bleak, remember the boy who inherits next, because Edward VI doesn't just rule briefly. He declines, slowly enough to terrify everyone, and quickly enough to leave no time to fix the problem. Edward VI, and the wasting that looked like consumption. Edward VI becomes king in 1547 at 9 years old. He is brilliant by the standards of the day, well-educated, devout, intensely serious, but he is also physically a child with a kingdom on his shoulders, and kingdoms, famously, are not great for your immune system. By early 1553, Edward's health worsens dramatically. Contemporary descriptions mention persistent coughing, weakness, and a visible wasting. The language used by observers and physicians drifts toward the familiar, ominous term, consumption. Again, it is an observational label. He is being consumed. Modern interpretations often suggest tuberculosis, possibly following earlier illnesses such as measles or smallpox, or complicated by chronic respiratory infection. The exact cause remains uncertain because we are reading symptoms filtered through Tudor medical language and political anxiety, but the shape of the decline is unmistakable. A young body losing weight, struggling to breathe, fading despite attention and care. Edward dies on 6 July 1553, still only 15. His death triggers a succession crisis almost immediately, because the adults around him try to control the future through paperwork, altering the line of inheritance in favour of Lady Jane Grey. It is a reminder that when a royal body fails, ink and ambition rush to fill the gap. There's a particularly cold detail in how consumption functions at court. It gives everyone time to plan. A sudden death shocks. A slow death invites strategy. You can almost hear the calculations in quiet rooms. Who will rule? Who will be forgiven? Who will be punished? And then comes Mary Throis, who has spent her life under pressure, humiliation and uncertainty, only to be undone by yet another antique medical label, one that sounds almost quaint until you realise what it implies. Mary, I and dropsy after the phantom pregnancy. Mary, I becomes queen in 1553 after a dramatic political struggle. She is the first crowned queen regnant of England, a woman ruling in her own right in a culture that keeps insisting women should not. She rules with intensity, with conviction, and with the heavy knowledge that her legitimacy has been questioned since her father's divorce from her mother. Mary's reign is defined by religion and fear. It is also defined by her body, specifically her desperate need for an heir. In 1554-1555, Mary appears to be pregnant. The court prepares. The nation waits. But the child never comes. Historians still debate what happened. False pregnancy, hormonal disorder, ovarian cysts, uterine fibroids, or a deeper systemic illness. By 1558, Mary is seriously unwell. Contemporary descriptions include swelling. Again, the word dropsy appears alongside weakness and fever. Dropsy, as before, is fluid retention, often a sign of organ failure or advanced disease. Some modern theories suggest uterine or ovarian cancer. Others point to influenza or other infections complicating an already fragile condition. The evidence supports a conclusion without pretending to perfect clarity. Mary was in significant decline, and the doctors of her time could not reverse it. She dies on 17th November 1558. The emotional cruelty is that her body had been drafted into politics, pregnancy as policy, fertility as legitimacy. When that body failed to produce an heir, it didn't just hurt her personally, it reshaped the nation's future. Elizabeth I's inherits next, and while Elizabeth's own death is famously difficult to diagnose with confidence, the dynasty's vulnerability to sickness doesn't pause, it simply changes form. In the next generation, a glittering prince, James I's eldest son, dies of a fever that doctors describe with a phrase that sounds like rotting. Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales, and the putrid fever. Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales, is the bright promise of the early Stuart era. Born in 1594, eldest son of James VI, he is popular, energetic, and surrounded by expectation. He is also, importantly, a focus of national hope. People project onto him everything they want the future to be. In 1612, he falls ill and dies on 6th November, at just 18. The language used at the time circles around fever, and later writers often identify it as typhoid fever. But one of the period's more unsettling terms is putrid fever, a phrase that reflects the belief that illness involved internal corruption, decay, and foulness. Its medical description is horror story. Something inside you has begun to rot. Accounts describe a severe illness with high fever and worsening condition over days. In a pre-modern city environment, typhoid, spread through contaminated food and water, was a plausible killer, even for princes. Money can buy privacy and comfort. It can't buy a separate sewage system. Henry's death devastates the court and the public. And here's the grim pattern again. An early death freezes a prince into perfection. He never becomes a flawed adult ruler. He remains the what might have been, which is always easier to love than what actually is. The political consequence is straightforward. His younger brother becomes heir, Charles, the future Charles V, and Charles's reign will end in civil war, trial, and execution. People who loved Henry Frederick did not just mourn a teenager. They mourned, in hindsight, a path history did not take. Meanwhile, James I himself is aging, sickly, and plagued, almost literally, by recurring fevers described in another old term that sounds harmless until you translate it. Ague. James Y and the Tertian Ague. James Y is a king of contradictions, scholarly and superstitious, politically shrewd and emotionally messy, a man who navigates court factions while also being profoundly vulnerable to bodily discomfort. His health is a frequent topic in letters and observations, not because people are fascinated by his pain, but because a king's body is a public resource. If it weakens, everything trembles. James dies on 27th March 1625. His later years include recurrent illness, and some accounts mention agues, periodic fevers with chills and sweating. One specific phrase that appears in early modern medical writing is tertian ague, a fever that recurs every third day. To modern eyes, that pattern suggests malaria, especially forms that cycle predictably. Malaria in England sounds surprising now, but in earlier centuries it was not unheard of, particularly in marshy regions. The word malaria itself comes later. People talked about bad air, miasma, the damp breath of wetlands. Whether James truly had malaria is debated, because agues was sometimes used loosely, but the periodic fever pattern, combined with his general decline, makes it plausible enough to discuss without claiming certainty. What is certain is the atmosphere of his final days. Physicians trying remedies, courtiers watching for signs, rumours breeding faster than bacteria. The king's treatment is also part of the story. Early modern medicine could be aggressive, purges, emetics, bloodletting, attempting to force the body back into balance. Sometimes that meant exhausting a patient already struggling. James's death passes the crown to Charles I, and within a generation the monarchy itself will be broken open by war. It's tempting to treat that as destiny. It's more honest to treat it as contingency, the future shaped by a fever that returned and returned until one day it didn't leave. And speaking of kings undone not by swords but by medical spectacle, The next royal death is almost grotesquely well documented, not because doctors understood it, but because they tried so many things that the attempt itself became a kind of slow-motion catastrophe. Charles II and the apoplexy that triggered a medical storm. Charles II dies on 6th February 1685, and his final illness is infamous because it reads like a catalogue of 17th century medical confidence. He collapses suddenly, often described as a fit or seizure, and the court panics. Physicians rush in, and then they do what elite physicians of the time were trained to do: intervene. The word that often gets attached to his death is apoplexy. Apoplexy is another old label, broad, vague, and terrifying. It generally refers to sudden loss of consciousness or paralysis, often what we would now call a stroke or brain hemorrhage. But the truth is that apoplexy could be used for various sudden collapses, including seizures, strokes, and metabolic crises. What makes Charles II's death feel so strange is the treatment frenzy. Historical accounts describe repeated bloodletting, purging, blistering, and enemas, an exhausting assault on a body already failing. The doctors weren't villains twirling moustaches. They were practitioners doing what their education told them was rational. But when the rational model is wrong, rational action becomes harm. Modern speculation about Charles's cause of death includes stroke, kidney failure, uremia, or other systemic collapse. The symptoms, sudden collapse, recurring fits, deterioration, fit multiple possibilities. The sources are detailed yet still not definitive, because details without correct theory can still mislead. The mood in the palace is easy to imagine: courtiers whispering, priests waiting, the sound of bowls and cloth and hurried footsteps, and a king, famous for laughter and survival, finally unable to outwit physics. And then, almost as if history wants to remind everyone it can be even more blunt, the next royal death is caused by a disease with no ambiguity at all, one of the most feared infections of early modern Europe, yet often described in courtly language as if politeness could soften it. Mary II and the speckled death of smallpox. Mary II dies on 28 December 1694 at 32, and the cause is widely agreed: smallpox. Smallpox is not obscure to us as a word, but the way people experienced it then feels almost alien. It was not simply a rash. It was a terrifying transformation: fever, pain, delirium, and then the eruption of lesions that could scar, blind, and kill. It moved through households like fire through dry cloth. In some accounts, smallpox is described with euphemisms or fearful nicknames. People sometimes spoke of it as the speckled monster, a phrase that captures how personal and predatory it felt. Royals were not protected. In fact, their close contact lives, crowded courts, constant visitors, could make them more exposed. Mary's death carries political weight. She co-ruled with her husband, William III. Her passing alters the emotional and administrative balance of the monarchy. It also adds to a growing, uneasy awareness among elites. You can have palaces and guards and fleets, and still be killed by an infection carried on breath and cloth. There's also an intimate sorrow. Mary is described as pious and dutiful, and in her final days she reportedly faced death with composure. That composure, though, doesn't make the disease less brutal. It just means the suffering happened behind closed doors, dressed in prayer instead of panic. Meanwhile, another royal woman, Queen Anne, will spend her life surrounded by pregnancy, loss, and chronic illness, and her death will be pinned to a word that makes it sound almost sleepy. It isn't. Queen Anne and dropsy at the end of too many grief. Queen Anne's reign, 1702-1714, is often remembered for politics: union with Scotland, party conflict, wars abroad. But the personal tragedy beneath the politics is relentless. Anne experiences numerous pregnancies and repeated loss. Few of her children survive infancy, and the one who seems to carry the future, William, Duke of Gloucester, dies young. Anne herself lives with chronic health problems, including painful attacks often described as gout, along with debilitating weakness. By the end, accounts describe swelling and decline, and once again the old term appears: dropsy. Dropsy functions like a curtain. It hides the mechanism while revealing the outcome. Fluid accumulation suggests organ failure, and in Anne's case, modern interpretations have proposed cardiovascular complications, kidney issues, or consequences of long-term illness. The evidence is historical and descriptive rather than clinical. We can't take her pulse. We can't run tests. We can only read the observations of people who watched her body swell and her energy vanish. Anne dies on 1st August 1714. Her death is not just the death of a person. It is a succession event so massive it changes the dynasty entirely. With no surviving heirs, the crown passes to the House of Hanover, George I, because Parliament has set the rules to favour Protestant succession. So yes, dropsy ends a queen's life, but it also ends a line's momentum. A single medical label becomes the hinge of national identity. And speaking of bodies that changed the direction of history, William III, Mary's husband, doesn't die from an infection in the ordinary sense. His end begins with something almost banal, a fall. And then the lungs, betrayed by inflammation, do what lungs have always done when they fail, turn breathing into a battle. William III, and peripneumony after the fall. William III survives war, politics, invasion, and the constant strain of ruling. And then, in 1702, a fall from a horse sets the stage for his death. The fall itself is serious, but the fatal spiral comes after. When injury limits mobility, weakness creeps in, and the body becomes vulnerable. The term that appears in medical contexts of the time is peripneumony, or peripneumonia, an old label for severe inflammation of the lungs, something like pneumonia, often used when the chest became tight, breathing laboured, fever intense. In an era without antibiotics, pneumonia is frequently a death sentence, especially in older or weakened patients. William dies on 8th March 1702. There's a strange cruelty in how often royal deaths are triggered by something that sounds minor, a stumble, a bruise, a broken bone, and then, quietly, inevitably, an infection takes advantage. History sometimes hinges not on grand drama but on the simple fact that the lungs filled and would not clear. The political consequences are wide. William's death, following Mary's earlier loss, further stabilizes the transition toward Anne and then the Hanoverian. It's a reminder that dynasties are not only toppled by rebellions, sometimes they simply run out of breath. Meanwhile, the Hanoverian court will bring new styles of politics and new medical language, but it will not bring immunity. One queen consort, Caroline of Ansbach, will die from a condition described in words that sound medieval even by Georgian standards: rupture and mortification. Queen Caroline of Ansbach, and the rupture that turned to mortification. Caroline of Ansbach, wife of George II, is one of the most influential consorts in British history. She is politically engaged, intellectually formidable, and deeply woven into the mechanics of power. She is also, like every royal figure, trapped inside a body that can fail regardless of how sharp the mind remains. Caroline dies on 20th November 1737. Her final illness is often linked to complications from a hernia, what contemporaries called a rupture. In a time before modern surgical safety, a hernia was not merely uncomfortable. It could become catastrophic if the bowel became trapped, strangulated, cutting off blood supply. That's where the next grim term enters: mortification. Mortification means tissue death, gangrene. It is the body's slow surrender, part of you dying while you're still alive, accompanied by pain, fever, and a sickly knowledge that something has gone irreversibly wrong. Treatments were limited, and surgery, while possible, carried enormous risk of infection and shock. Contemporary accounts describe Caroline's suffering and the court's anxious attention. This is not the neat storybook end of a queen. It is a physically ugly death, dressed in ceremony. There is also an unsettling clarity to it. Unlike dropsy or egg, rupture and mortification tells you something concrete. Anatomy failed, then blood supply failed, then tissue died. It's a reminder that the old medical vocabulary, while often vague, could also be brutally direct when something became visible and unmistakable. And speaking of deaths that arrive suddenly, the next royal figure collapses in a way that shocked observers. Frederick, Prince of Wales, whose end was blamed on the chest itself, with a familiar old word that once covered 1,000 miseries, pleurisy. Frederick, Prince of Wales, and pleurisy in the prime of life. Frederick, Prince of Wales, is the heir who never becomes king. Born in 1707, he lives in constant tension with his father, George II, and his role is shaped by faction and performance. He cultivates popularity, sponsors culture, and becomes a kind of alternative court, an heir with his own gravitational pull. Then, in 1751, he dies suddenly on 31st March at 44. Accounts of Frederick's death vary in detail, but one term that appears in discussions of sudden chest-related illness is pleurisy, an inflammation of the lining around the lungs, often associated with sharp pain and fever. In earlier medical writing, pleurisy could be used broadly, and it could be attached to pneumonia, pulmonary embolism, or other acute events. Modern interpretations sometimes suggest a pulmonary embolism or internal hemorrhage, because sudden collapse in an otherwise active man can point to clotting or cardiovascular catastrophe. But it's important to be honest. The historical record does not give a single clean answer. What it gives is shock, the sense that a prince expected to live simply didn't, and that the court had to rearrange its expectations in a single day. Frederick's death matters because it shifts the line of succession. His son becomes the next in line, George III, so an adult prince's sudden end sets up the long reign that will include war in America, political upheaval, and the slow transformation of Britain's global identity. And speaking of long reigns and fragile bodies, we now move into the 19th century, where the language of diagnosis becomes more scientific sounding, but still clings to old euphemism. One of the strangest is a phrase that sounds like indigestion, yet was often a polite mask for something lethal: gastric fever. Prince Albert and the gastric fever diagnosis. Prince Albert, husband of Queen Victoria, dies on 14 December 1861. His death is one of the defining griefs of the Victorian age, not only because Victoria loved him deeply, but because his role had become central to the monarchy's modern image: industry, morality, family. The diagnosis given at the time was typhoid fever, but it was also described using a term that feels oddly evasive: gastric fever. That phrase reflects a 19th century medical habit of labeling systemic infections by their dominant symptoms: stomach pain, fever, weakness, without always understanding the exact pathogen. Typhoid is spread through contaminated water and food, and in a world still struggling with sanitation, it could reach even the most privileged households. Albert's illness unfolds over weeks, with fever and exhaustion. The court physicians, though far more advanced than Tudor doctors, still lived in an era before antibiotics. Supportive care existed. Real cures for bacterial infections did not. His death transforms Victoria. She enters prolonged mourning, reshaping royal culture for decades. It also reveals something uncomfortable. The monarchy could modernize its image, sponsor science, champion progress, and still be vulnerable to the basic public health infrastructure of sewers and clean water. Progress is not evenly distributed. It never has been. And with that, we've crossed centuries of royal sickness, old words clinging to human fear: flux, ague, dropsy, mortification, putrid fever. Each term is a small time capsule. It tells you how people tried to make sense of suffering when the body became a mystery and the stakes were national. Now let's close the book gently, without pretending the story is tidy. If there's a single thread running through these 25 deaths, it's this: royal life never defeated biology. It only decorated it. From Henry I's surfeit to Mary Wine's dropsy, from the Black Prince's grinding consumption to Caroline of Ansbach's rupture and mortification, the old diagnostic words sound quaint until you translate them into lived reality. Bloody flux is not an interesting phrase. It's dehydration, pain, and fear in a cold room. Ague isn't a charming historical detail. It's fever returning like a curse every few days, wearing the body down. Dropsy isn't a sleepy Victorian label. It's swelling that can mean your heart or kidneys are losing the fight, and everyone around you is pretending not to be alarmed. And then there's the deeper discomfort, how often these illnesses became political tools. A sickness could be moralized, punishment for indulgence, proof of divine favor withdrawn. It could be weaponized through rumor, poison whispered where cancer was more likely, scandal attached where uncertainty left space. Even grief could be used, shaped into propaganda, turned into a story that served whoever survived. But the most unsettling truth might be the simplest one. These were not exotic royal plagues reserved for palaces. Most of them were the same killers that stalked ordinary streets: contaminated water, infected wounds, childbirth, winter lungs, fevers bred by crowding and poor sanitation. The difference is that when a peasant died of the flux, history barely noticed. When a prince died of the same misery, dynasties shifted, parliaments panicked, and the future rerouted itself. So as you drift towards sleep, keep that quiet paradox in mind. The crown looks like power, but it sits on a human head. And human bodies, no matter how crowned, no matter how guarded, can still be undone by a sip of bad water, a fever that won't break, or an infection no one yet knows how to name. If you want another long British history sleep documentary, leave a comment with the next topic you'd like me to cover, and I'll meet you there, somewhere dimly lit, centuries away, where the past is still breathing.